Hi, this is Matt from Skybow. You need hours to figure out the problem in your business process? Then we have two great features to help you. Today, first topic is the debugging possibilities, where we have a look at what's possible, especially to our new debug mode we've launched just 1 or 2 weeks ago. And afterwards, some general error handling possibilities. Most of it will be, as always, the demo time. All right, so the debug mode is a new mode you can activate in the solution settings or on any action builder. There's a new toggle at the bottom, and that's always activated per site or per solution. And doesn't matter where you activate it, it's always for the whole site. So it will be activated everywhere. And the infos about the debugging part you will find in the console of your browser. So if you press F12, you open up the console debugging tools, you would see a new part, as you can see here, where you see skybow debug mode, and it will log everything, including inputs and outputs from your actions. So let's say you have, and it's like it's in the title, it's client side only. So for button actions, command bar actions, page actions, etc. All the actions that you have there and the loop controls and the condition controls, they will be locked into the console, as you can see on the screenshot. And for everything, you can find the input values and also the output values of the actions. Because in some cases, you probably have an input which is a variable or an array or something, or an expression which you cannot test in the expression builder because it's not yet evaluated. So this way you can easily activate a debug mode and you can find every input and output variable in the console afterwards. There's also an option to do that in deployments. So you can activate this debug mode also for all the deployments, and it doesn't matter if it's an API deployment, a direct deployment, or a manual deployment. So for every deployment, you can activate it for a certain time to test something. Maybe it's not possible to have or you don't have that error in your dev site, but maybe with production data, you can also debug in production sites like this. I will show you how to activate it in the demo. And for sure, there's still the option to add a manual debugger into function expressions. So if you have some code somewhere in outside of an action builder, maybe also in a calculated column or whatever, you can add debugger. I will show you that also in the demo. You can add debugger, and then you can step through in the console to see something similar. You see what are the current values, etc., and you can watch at variables and so on. So that's about the debugging itself. And regarding error handling, I mean, in the client-side actions, you always have a direct feedback. So if you press a button somewhere, if there's some errors, you will see them on the top of the page. So in the combination with the debug mode, it should be easier to find the actual error. But in triggered and scheduled actions, we only have the history. So there's an action history. You see if they were successfully executed or if there was an error. And these background actions, they're also deactivated after 10 times failing. And there will be an email sent to the solution owner, which is all good for error handling. But who is looking at the history all the time? I mean, if you have a history, especially in deployments, in production, and so on, and you're sending some, maybe you have an important process and there are some errors, and some errors are not deactivating the action because the input data is probably wrong. It's not a wrong configuration. The configuration is okay, but sometimes the input, field is empty or not. So these errors, we will not deactivate the action because it's not a configuration error. And those errors you would only see in the history. But then you always have to look at the history from time to time, but there was no possibility to get an error, for example, with an email or a notification. And that's where we now implemented this new scope action control. That's the one you see here on the right. It's similar to the Power Automate scope control. Main difference is we try to make it even easier to have one block with actions that are executed. And if all these actions, if something goes wrong in that scope, we have this has failed block where you can add another action block or multiple actions, and also if it's successful. So you can, in that scenario, you get some items, you loop over them, and then you can send an email if it's successful, and maybe another one if it's not successful to a certain support box or whatever, or to a person who created the item, and so on. So with this, you can easily you get notified about errors in background action, and that was really a missing part for error handling. So I prepared, for the demo, I prepared 2 little scenarios, and the first one is using my standard expense demo that I was demoing several times so far. So let's assume we have an expense list. We create a new expense. And now what this is doing, if I press submit, it will save the item and it will send an email to the manager, and it will calculate a number for the expense request and so on. What could fail here possibly is if you enter someone who's not in the system, or let's say you take a group, you have something configured, like I will take an admin group like this. You can configure it that it's possible to choose groups, and that would fail if you press submit. It will fail, and here that's already the error message that I'm showing in the has failed block. So if we look in the background, now we open up the console pressing F12, and we can see up here some. So here, that's the skybow debug mode. We see some actions, or always the action with its name. It sets some values. It saves the item, and I don't know what that. And then down here, it generates a number, and here you see the inputs and the outputs. That's an update list item action. We have some inputs where we set the expense number, and we have to tell the action what item that should be updated. And this always has the item ID again as an output. But yeah, the activity we see, for example, here I was using an expression, and it's now evaluated. These expressions are evaluated. And let's think you have a variable and you define that variable. Then in the expression builder, you cannot test that variable. And this way, you could check what the value of the variable would be and what will be passed to the actual action. And then we will see, okay, there's an error in the send mail here. And if we open up these input parameters, we can see the body and so on, but we see that the to field is empty and that will cause the error. So, I mean, in that case, we have a proper error message, but in some other cases, you probably don't know because it's a very generic message, but you could analyze what's really passed to that action and what's not. And that's where we also see the scope if failure. So that's the if it was not correct, if there was an error, then that's the action. I have a show message, which is for 10 seconds, and that's the error message. If you look into the configuration of that action, and yeah, by the way, to activate that debug mode, we can, like I said, we can do that on the site settings or solution settings page in this on this gear icon. We have that debug mode here, so you can disable it, save, or enable it. And the same is on every action builder. So if I open up this new form, that was on the submit button. So this button here, it's a command bar action. Actions. That's the debug mode here on the bottom. And here it's only this toggle. You can deactivate it and now it's already deactivated. You don't have to save or something. It's just activated and then it's there. Here I was also using this new scope control. And the new scope control looks like this. You have these 3 boxes where you can place actions. It's also helpful to just structure your actions. So if you have a lot of actions executed on a button click, you can also use that scope for structuring only. In my case, I have a couple of actions that are executing, and then I have 2 parts: is successful and has failed. And in this has failed, so in these 2 boxes, in both of them, we can access. So this scope control is also having an output parameter or 3 output parameters. We can find them in the expression builder actions and then the scope control. We can return successful or has failed. It's true or false. And the error message itself. And that can be used inside these 2 blocks. So like I'm doing here. Or you can also use it outside. So let's say you have some more actions, blah, blah, blah. And then somewhere down here, you add a condition for that action that's similar to how you do it in Power Automate. You could say a condition, and then you can still access that output has failed. So you can run it only if it is successful, for example. Or you can use the error message for something else. So these 3 are available inside, but also outside of the scope control up here. And the second thing I was doing is, let's delete them again, or no, let's just cancel, open it up. So the second thing was, if I want to really debug, I want to step through, I can still, and that's possible anywhere where you have an expression, you can, like here, you have a function and it needs to be a function. You can add this debugger semicolon and then your code. And this way it will stop. It will stop in at that section if you have the console open. So if you go back here, clear, let's do it again, clear. Now I press submit and it will stop at that point now it stopped, and you see that's my function code. And now I can really, like in Visual Studio Code or whatever, you can step through using F10, F11, step inside, and you can always watch the actual values or the properties, or even arrays, objects, etc. And you can, if it's an object, like this one, placeholder down here. Let's go further. You can always use, for example, this one, placeholder. During the debug mode, you can go to console and, for example, type in dollar placeholder, and then you can have a look at it here as well. You can try some codes that you can afterwards copy to your expression. So that's sometimes very helpful. Or you just yeah, add them to the watch list here on the right while you step through. So like in normal Visual Studio debugging, you can do that here as well. Yeah, and then you can press play again. And now it's successful, submitted and closed. So this way it was all successful, and we have it like this. Now switching over to another scenario where I'm using the scope control in the background. I'm using our contract management template, where we have contracts and we have some scheduled actions where we can set them to expire or extend, etc. And in the expire part, it's normal scheduled action. We expire them if the end date is today and the status is still active. That's my filter. And for all of them, I have the following actions. I'm updating and sending an email. And then if something goes wrong here, I will send this email to like solution support or whatever. So it's the same approach here. What I would like to show here is I have a deployment. So that's my developer side. So I would see the history here. Maybe something to add here. If everything works well, then it's green like this. And you can see, okay, it was working. We do it like this. The scope control, we see the execution result. It is successful. And then all my actions that were successful. In my case, the scope section is successful, has no action. That's why it's empty here. And if it is a wrong configuration, it will fail completely like this. So it has failed, and it was really, in that case, I also configured an error in the has failed scope. So then it fails completely. So here my send internal email in the has failed scope failed as well. That's why it's completely red. And this one, that's the latest. That's the case when it has failed, but the has failed section was successful. So then we show in the history, we show it as warning only. So it's not failed, but it's a warning because we handled that error with the scope control. So this action failed. It went to the has failed section, but the has failed section was successfully, so the email was sent. And this way we only mark it as a warning. All right, what I would like to show here is if we have deployments And of course, it's working for site API deployments, but also added deployments. And that's again in my other solution. Yeah, that's here. Sorry, that's in the expense demo. So here I have a couple of deployments. I also have that add-in deployment. And for those of you who didn't know so far, on each deployment, doesn't matter which one, we have that deployment maintenance section. So you select the deployment and then click on deployment maintenance. Here you can see everything like background actions, calculated columns, and so on, and also the debug mode. So I can activate debug mode for this deployment. So before I activate it, I will go there. It's a separate site, a separate solution, can be another tenant, wherever. And now if we open up console, I mean, this is already a skybow automation action here. So for now, we see nothing happens. If I go back and activate that debugging mode, save it, refresh my page, and then if I press the button now, we see skybow debug mode is working. I mean, this button is only opening a form, so that's not very interesting. But yeah, I'll do the same here. John Smith, clear again, submit, and you see the debug mode is working. Even the debugger will work here, but that's also the case without the debug mode. So if you add a debugger, for sure, but it's not nice to have these debugger things, of course, in production deployments. So that was working. And yeah, that's how you can do it. Once you figure out the issue, simply deactivate the mode again, and that's it. So this debug mode information is stored in a site, in the site assets library.
I hope you can now save time and hassle and build a more reliable process.